Okay, so this is our reflection on the syllabication lesson, where I use direct instruction.
Okay.
So on this one, I wrote down that some strengths were that it was a good use of a direct instruction lesson because it allowed the students to practice breaking things up into syllables as a whole class, then as smaller groups in their table groups, and then we ended with an independent practice.
Good.
So that was really good in walking them through. And the quiz that I came up with, I thought was a good assessment for the week, even though that weird thing came up with my wording on one of them, which may have confused the students. But I think that was also good because, like, my professor talks about Trojan victories and unintended results in the beginning of every class. So we talk about things that went well and then things that goofed. And so I think this will be a good one for this week because it shows like the nuances of your language and how students interpret it.
Yeah.
And then weaknesses, I have not having a greater variety of words. Maybe I could have had ones that are a little longer, or maybe words that they worked on in their vocabulary before, just to switch it up from the ones that were mostly they might have been exposed to already and things like that.
Good.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I agree. I felt this was actually a fairly strong lesson. I mean, it's kind of more one of those like vanilla lessons where it's like you got to teach it, you give them time to practice it, and then you give them time to work on your own. It's kind of one of those things where it's like you're learning the skill. It's not going to be the most exciting stuff, but I felt all around you did a very good job with it. I felt this was actually a very strong lesson, and I think that your assessment attests to that, because they scored fairly well on it. Like they did good, and even with like the concern you had with it not maybe being formatted in a way where it was kind of not clear, like they still scored well enough that you know that they understood it well enough to, even if that was a problem, it didn't impact their grades too much because they all did pretty well.
Exactly.
And it wasn't in any way an easy assessment or anything. Like I looked through it to make sure it was okay. Like I wasn't just gonna be like, all right, it's easy. And yeah, it was challenging enough where I think it was a good assessment of the material. So I feel like you actually did a very good job of teaching this. Like they seemed to get the skill pretty well. So going through strengths, your intro actually was good. It grabbed the students' attention. I don't remember specifically what it was at this point.
Yeah,
but
this one was...
I wrote down that it was interesting. And
it was, I compared it to video games. How come I can't just go to the level my little brother's on? I have to progress through.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought that was good because it made the point that like they needed to understand something before they could really just do it. Like you can't just do it until you learn the things you need to get to that point. And they understood that it wasn't like you can't just skip ahead. You have to get this practice before you can move on to it. Cool. And I thought that was good. Like they actually made that connection. You didn't have to spell it out for them.
Exactly.
You had a student actually say it, so that was great. I liked how in terms of planning, you had time where you had instruction where you showed them, and then you did it together. You guided them through it, and then you let them work on it independently. So that's important. You have to have all three of those things to really have it be successful. So and the guided practice is the hardest part because a lot of times you want to get up and say, this is how it's done, now go do it. But unless you, then some of them will be fine with that. But unless you guide the class through it and give them a chance to make those mistakes and then say, okay, this is what you have to do next time, then when they get to the independent practice, it's just so much harder. So I thought it was planned out very well. Other strengths, with the way you distinguished everything on the board, that was something that we talked about before.
Yeah.
So I was glad that you differentiated things with colors. It made it very clear when there was a new rule. You also had them say rule number 1, rule number 2, so they knew it was something new. And then you put it in a different color just to further cement that, okay, this is different than what we already did, don't get them confused. So that was good, especially because you were going over 3 different rules. It needed to be clear so that they knew what they were doing, and so that was great. You gave them time to talk with partners. Not only that, but you had them check with their partners, and I think you actually had them explain. Yeah, you had students explain their answers as well. So it wasn't just, okay, this is your answer, do you agree, disagree? But you actually said, okay, now tell me why, which is great because that's bringing their thinking to a whole nother level. They can't just guess their answer; they have to explain it. And then there's going to be students who are going to be listening to the explanation and that might be the way they need to hear it in order to understand it. So I thought that was very, very good.
And I tried to differentiate the questions a little, because as soon as I put something on the board, I would see hands go up, and I didn't even ask a question yet. So of course you think I'm going to ask you the factual, where does it go, but instead I'm going to ask you which rule did you use, and why. So,
and that was great, because it forced them to pay attention to the questions you're asking, and not just running off, I already know this, I know what it's going to be, I'm going to answer it, but they actually had to be thinking about it and listening to you. So I thought that was great. Your vocabulary was good. You've monitored the class fairly well in terms of making sure they weren't having too many side conversations or anything else. So I thought that was good. Yeah, and that's something that you're always going to be, I mean, I'm still working on it. Everyone constantly works on that, because each group is different, and it's just getting into that zone is difficult with each group.
Having eyes everywhere.
Yeah. So, but I felt for the most part you did a very good job of monitoring them. So that was good. A couple things to work on. I noted before, and again, I wrote down wait time again. I can't really say any specifics, but try to be sure that you are giving them enough time to really think. And it is a hard thing to do, because you feel like, all right, I'm just wasting time right now, but some of them need the extra time to think. So I wrote that down. That
would also give me ample time to, I noticed that you rephrase the question sometimes, and then more hands go up in that meantime.
Yeah.
So that's where I can use my wait time to my benefit as well.
And that's good too, because it gives you time to think about the question that you asked and say, okay, are there no hands because they're not listening to me? Are there no hands because I didn't explain it in a way? Are there no hands because it's still just difficult for them? You know, or if there's a lot of hands, you know, okay, well, this is probably going well, but I'm going to wait just to make sure my slowest ones are going to have a chance, you know? Ideally, you want all of their hands to go up, but they're not all going to go up right away, and so you want to try to give them time. And if hands just aren't going up, you know you need to move on, but you want to try to give them that time just to be sure. So that's one thing. And then the only other thing that I would say is a major, or is one thing that you want to really focus on, or be mindful of, I guess. Be sure that the explanations are always clear, especially when you're introducing something. So what I noticed was with this one, you were like, okay, it's a new rule. It's rule number 2. Everyone's like, rule number 2. And you wrote down what the rule is, like consonant plus AL. You know, so how would we divide up this word? But then you never actually gave the explanation of what the rule meant. And the ones that were really on it went, oh, it's consonant AL, that's where I'm going to split it. But the lower ones are going to go, okay, it's consonant AL, but what does that mean?
What does that mean?
Yeah. And so you want to be sure that you're always explicit with instructions, especially when you're doing rules, because there are the ones who will figure it out from the examples or who might know it right away, but unless you say, okay, what this means is that when we have a consonant in the letter AL, we have to split it beforehand, you know, and then say, for example, in this word, I can see there's a consonant AL, so this is where I'm going to split it, so how would we do it in this word? Like, unless you give them that explanation, you're going to have some of them who are just going to, you know, they won't pick up on it. So just always be sure that your explanations are clear for rules, and the same thing for directions. If you're passing out a sheet and you want to go over the directions, be sure that it's always explicit, that you're explaining it as clearly as possible, just so that they know it. So that was the only other thing. I mean, I have some little things. The time was a little bit long, but wasn't really a big deal for this one. But everything else was fine. Like those are the only 2 things that I would say are in the sort of concern.
And I'm realizing I didn't put the times on each piece, so I'll work on that on my next, especially when they're this long. Okay.
But yeah, I felt this was actually a fairly strong lesson, and I feel that your assessment really attested to the fact that you did a good job, because they got it, and they still seem to remember it today, so it has sticking power, so that's good too.
That's my goal. Awesome.